Greetings, everybody, and welcome to my presentation on the history of education in Western civilization. As we begin, I'd like to tell you a little about my background and why I've come to care about this topic. First, I have two children. I've been homeschooling. This will be my 15th year, following primarily a classical approach, although it's been somewhat eclectic as well with Charlotte Mason and other approaches included. Prior to becoming a home educator, I spent almost 17 years in mental health and social services. And with my kids almost launched, I decided to go back to school. And just this past year, I earned my master's degree in education. I'm a researcher by nature, and over the years, as I homeschooled my kids, I did a great deal of reading on the historical roots of education, what some call classical education. And I've learned a lot. It's made me passionate about spreading the word to parents about how the schools got to the point that people like me began to exit the system. Although my primary reason for homeschooling stemmed from a desire to teach my faith to our children, I think it's fair to say that a lot of parents have departed the system hoping to escape what they believe is a very broken education system. But my research pointed to something else, that while the schools may appear to be broken, they're doing exactly what educational policymakers have purposed them to do. These systemic changes have not been made just to the schools, but to the colleges, training and licensing, even the most well-intentioned teachers. And it has transformed these public schools under a new directive. Changes to the pedagogy have been so subtle that parents don't realize what these new methods are intended to accomplish in their children. I feel it's important to show parents this because homeschooling is difficult. And when temptation comes to put our kids back into school, we may convince ourselves that we've found a good one, or that we may minimize the influence that schools have on our children's worldview. In this presentation, we're going to start by attempting to define education and its meaning and purpose, and discovering how Western education first developed, and then later how it changed from its classical Christian roots to become what it is today, and what home educators can do to prompt authentic learning in our home schools. Now, before we begin, let's differentiate learning from education. Now, learning's happening all the time in every aspect of our lives from birth until death. In fact, about 60 to 80% of our learning is informal, meaning it takes place outside of a classroom or formal education setting. For the purposes of this presentation, however, we're going to be discussing the concept of formal learning within a K-12 setting. So to begin our discussion of formal education, we have to answer a few important questions. The first being, what is education? Is it the filling of an empty vessel? And if so, is there a limit to how much can be learned? And is it a transfer of knowledge or information from one to another? And if that's true, how do we measure it? Secondly, what is the purpose of getting a formal education? Is it to prepare for college, or is it to prepare for a job? Is it to acquire soft skills like communication or time management, or to develop life skills like budgeting or car repair? We know that the government schools have it wrong and education has lost its way. Even as declining hard and soft schools plague our schools and the workforce, the schools continue to emphasize this notion that education is nothing more than a transfer of knowledge or a preparation for work. The worst part is they measure their success almost exclusively through standardized tests. As home educators, we know that education is much deeper than distribution of information and regurgitating it on a test, or preparation for a job. But how do we produce true meaning in our schools? How do we produce purpose in our education? How do we build learning capacity in our children to help them become lifelong learners? Lastly, how do we overcome these shortages being experienced in the public education system and ensure that we're not inadvertently bringing those flawed mindsets into our home schools? To do this, we need to look back as far as 400 BC, ancient Greece and the great halls of Athens. The Greeks gave us many great things, from language to democracy, but more importantly, they gave us the concept that was known to them as paideia. Now, paideia simply translated as education or upbringing, but to the Greeks, it was actually much more. It was the transmission of culture, the lifeblood and strength of their society. The Greeks were theists, and Greek society was democratic. They believed in a created world and wanted to build a system of culture and meaning. They taught or they sought ideals that would serve a purpose that was higher than a government system. Now, prior to the Greek paideia, children were taught to obey and serve their rulers, and their training and upbringing were focused primarily on learning a trade. But as Greek culture became more focused on democracy and building a strong, free society, they recognized that teaching men to think freely had to take precedence over occupational training. And so, under the Greek paideia, men first learned how to wrestle with ideas, to use logic and reasoning in order to think for themselves. Once they were properly educated in how to think, they would study a trade, which hopefully served their higher interest or purpose. In order to educate free citizens, the pursuit of wisdom and reasoning superseded the pursuit of an occupation. Now, this quest of educating for wisdom, not work, gave birth to what is called the liberal arts. Liberal because it created liberated or free thinking human beings. These liberal arts began with grammar, logic, and rhetoric in the early years, adding mathematics, geometry, music, and astronomy as children advanced. All of these liberal arts were taught within a strong moral framework of wisdom, virtue, and moral philosophy. In addition, they spent time in the gymnasium building physical fitness and athleticism. The seven liberal arts were not subjects. They were integrated concepts working together within this moral framework. In modern education, we often describe the trivium subjects as the humanities. Humanities because they are focused on understanding the nature of man and the importance of his virtue. The quadrivium subjects naturally follow because once you understand the nature of humanity, then you would need a strong knowledge of the created world in order to determine man's place and his purpose within it. Additionally, the terms truth, goodness, and beauty featured prominently in Greek life and shaped its educational worldview. The Greeks and later the Romans believed that the created world had indisputable meaning and purpose, which were reflected in these universal realities of truth, goodness, and beauty. Philosophers such as Plato believed that man's nature was created to reflect those values, and thus they became guiding principles within their paideia. They also believed that these values were objective and that a noble man could come to know these values because his nature was created to live in harmony via his logos, ethos, and pathos. So truth reveals the nature of reality through our logos, our ability to reason. Goodness reveals reality to our ethos or moral capacity, and beauty is the delight in the truth and goodness of something that draws us to it through our pathos or our senses. Western civilization adopted these ideas because they were confirmed by the revelation of Scripture and the nature of the triune God. God is truth, goodness, and beauty, and all he created is true, good, and beautiful. Man was created in God's image with a nature to recognize these universal realities and live in harmony with them. But with one key difference from Greco-Roman thought, Christianity taught that after the fall, the natural man, being dead in his sin, lost his ability to recognize these truths without first being aligned to his creator through the forgiveness of sins. Thus, where Greeks and Romans thought that the natural man could use wisdom or reason to see these things, Judeo-Christian thought requires a spiritual restoration before that can happen. So the Greek contributed natural law, objective observation, moral philosophy, in the scientific method to the world, honoring man's unique power of logic and reasoning. And equally, the Christian church taught of an orderly and created universe, a creator who provides moral wisdom, justice, mercy, and truth, honoring individuals as bearers of God's image. Together, the best of both of these ideas united to form the classical Christian paideia. Logic and natural law from Greek reason, combined with the truths of biblical revelation, together became the foundation for Western civilization as we have known it. Over 1,000 years later, as America was being settled, the Western tradition remained central to the education system, with local community-based schools raising these pillars of faith, family, and freedom by educating free citizens of virtuous character who could think for and direct themselves as they built a new republic. The early American paideia continued the tradition of comprehensive moral and liberal arts education, which was complete by the 8th grade, followed by skills-based apprenticeship or a college training thereafter. Kindergarten was added in the 1850s, but not mandated until education became compulsory in 1918. Now, here are two examples of graduation exams from 1895 and 1910. The tests included foundational skills in grammar, spelling, reading, arithmetic, history, geography, and science. The core skills were still emphasized, but within a moral framework of biblical truth. I wonder how many of us could pass that test today. In time, however, the American paideia came under attack, and it wasn't during the 2020 global pandemic. As America and the world became more industrial and educational movements were forming to move children out of the classical paideia to one singularly focused on vocational training in order to fill the need for industrial workers. And so in the early 1900s, the progressive movement and people like John Dewey, an atheist and secular humanist, worked diligently to redefine the purpose of education, not as the transmission of culture and the maintenance of a free society, but no, they wanted to seek a practical education focused only on the skills the students need. So I'm not sure what the pragmatists thought the only skill set people needed, but they definitely weren't logic, reasoning, and critical thinking. The changes being made to the schools under their model was undoing the beauty and goodness of classical paideia, and it was transforming children back into servants of the state. So by 1918, when formal education became compulsory in every state, the agenda to reinvent education was well underway. In order to make these changes, Christian values and prayer were removed or reduced to a single subject taught either off campus or separate from the other courses and not woven into every subject as a moral framework. The study of history, along with logic and reasoning, was replaced with social science and social justice training. Now, the goal was not to teach children how to think, but what to think. And the moral framework was no longer objective, but subjective or relative based on social consensus or personal opinion. Personal responsibility and moral education were replaced with something called social emotional learning. Now, the significance of social emotional learning is that nearly all of the social sciences teach that people are a product of society and social structures, not that people build societies and social structures. So if you've been paying attention, then you would know that this is a basic tenet of Marxist ideology. So for every new idea that was added, something else had to be eliminated. In order to include all of this new training, the school day was lengthened and graduation was postponed to 12th grade. By the time education became federalized in 1979, with the creation of the Department of Education, most of the damage to the Western Christian paideia was already done. A moment ago, we mentioned the philosophy of social emotional learning within schools, which teaches that individuals are a product of societies and social structures. This sociological construct is a fundamental worldview populating our school boards and teachers unions because it's being taught at the teachers' colleges. Without biblical theology, or really any theology, they do not recognize man's fallen nature, but instead view him as a victim of society's injustices, not the author of them. Because of this, they believe that social engineering can perfect mankind, can make him good, and rid the world of suffering. Now, this worldview is in contrast to Judeo-Christian thought, which acknowledges man's inherent fallibility and understands that social institutions are shaped by the character of the individuals who create them. And the individual under this worldview is spiritually dead and unable to know what is good or bad, nor change his circumstance unless first redeemed by his creator. This is why a Judeo-Christian worldview is essential in the classroom, because it focuses first on understanding the nature of man, spiritually, mentally, and physically, and then determining his proper place and purpose within God's creation. Within this worldview, man acknowledges that the best way to fix social institutions and societies is to first align his character, or align the character of each individual to his creator, with the goal of not repeating the mistakes from the past. This alignment with God connects him to the universal reality of truth, goodness, and beauty. These worldviews are at war within our public education system. One rejects and the other accepts the institutions created by God as stabilizing forces in our society. One worldview seeks to dismantle these institutions, and they are accomplishing this through the government education system. When thinking about the importance of our worldview, consider this French illustration from 1899. This is a rendition of what the artist believed France would look like in the year 2000. Notice how the information is simply being poured into the students' brains, really without question, and that the theology or that the technology was preeminent as books are being eliminated. Their ideas weren't exactly on the money, but this is what view the people had accepted that they were moving toward. So, what can be done? As homeschoolers, we see that public schools are a threat to our faith, our families, and our freedom. But how do we, as parents and home educators, prompt authentic learning and build capacity in our children as they move into an increasingly complex marketplace of ideas and have to face these competing ideologies? Well, first, we need to acknowledge that education is much more than filling of an empty vessel or simply transferring information from one to another. Education is building capacity to learn in our children. And we do this by asking hard questions, wrestling with ideas, solving problems, and studying fewer subjects but more deeply, always within a moral framework and building rational, logical, and ordered thinking. Next, let's shift away from the idea that education's purpose is to prepare our children for work. Its purpose is to prepare them for life. And as Christians, we're preparing them for life beyond life. After this life, we're preparing them for eternity. Our first steps have to do with commitment. Our commitment may begin with acknowledging that public schools are a threat to our values, removing them from that threat, and committing to stay the course. But once we've acknowledged what is behind us, we then have to focus on looking forward and establishing a vision for our homeschools by asking ourselves, why are we making this choice? This also includes making some goals or setting a mission for what we want to accomplish in our children and as a homeschooling family. And everybody's reasons are going to be different. We use these goals to make plans and order our days as much as possible around those goals. We should be mindful that as home educators, we are outliers, we're disruptors, and it requires strength to go against the norm. So we need a network and we need to collaborate with like-minded people. Support and encouragement will give us strength to carry on during hard times, and they're going to come because raising children is hard and educating children is hard, and things that are hard are nearly always worth doing. Although the moral and educational requirements of our children is the central focus of our homeschools, we cannot neglect the importance of our own needs. By adopting a growth mindset and developing our own mental, emotional, and spiritual and instructional skills, and growing alongside of our children, we model lifelong learning to our children and foster a love of learning. This is another place where collaboration helps. Other moms can direct you to resources that will help you grow in areas that you may find you're weaker. By doing all these things, we become stronger and more courageous to stay the course and fight the good fight. We want to cross the finish line for the sake of our children and for our families and for our society. The very last thing I'm going to talk about is how to build truth, goodness, and beauty into your teaching. This is done by teaching our children that the world is filled with divine meaning and purpose, and that the created world is ordered, not random, nor arbitrary or relative. We do not have to subscribe to the classical model of education or even Christian values to do this, but we do need to align our teaching to these universal values of truth, goodness, and beauty. C.S. Lewis wrote in The Abolition of Man that modern education was separating students from truth, beauty, and goodness, and thus the ability to develop virtue. If your children's morality is important to you, cultivating virtue in your children begins here. Now, for me, it begins with teaching my children the truth from the Bible and teaching them that the truth is knowable and objective and not based on personal experiences, preferences, or feelings. Additionally, we do not teach our faith, moral philosophy, or apologetics as subjects apart from math and English. All subjects are taught within a moral framework of being part of the creation. All subjects are owned and created by God and become a glimpse into God's truth and goodness. Remember, the world teaches that truth is relative. It's defined by the individual, and this creates chaos and disorder. Teach your children to love the wisdom of spiritual faith by engaging them in it regularly so it becomes a part of them, mind, body, and soul. We continue by teaching them that goodness is a divine obligation and it is not situational. God has created a world that is good, and goodness has an order to it. One principle of goodness is that the fall of man and sin led to death, corruption, and chaos. But goodness in our faith, the goodness of Jesus Christ, leads to life. He is good when we are unable to be good. One of the essential ways that we foster goodness in our homeschools is by creating order in our homeschools. Our homeschools should be sacred, set apart, an expression of our appreciation of God, a God who put things in order. Thus, teaching our children standards, rules, and etiquette to be considerate and loving of other people is a reflection of the virtue that we wish to align with in our faith, and it teaches us how to build self-control. Now, in literature, we teach the great books. We read and teach stories that help us find meaning in the world. They offer universal themes like sacrifice, honesty, or strength found in suffering. We teach that math creates order and harmony, and that without it, we would not have homes or bridges, or even a society. Science, geometry, music, they all point to universal patterns of harmony and order, and they testify to a creator who has called his creation good. Each item fulfilling a purpose within the universe, just as we are to fulfill a purpose. Every subject testifies to God's truth and God's goodness and builds a child's moral imagination. Children with a developed moral imagination can discern the presence or lack of purpose in things, in everything that they encounter, and thus recognize the thing's goodness or lack of goodness. Finally, we persevere in teaching our children to recognize or to crave, to love what is beautiful. Beauty is the physics which draws us to that which is true and good. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beauty functions on the law of attraction. Beauty is an attraction, but attraction can be based upon truth and goodness, or it can be based upon carnal desires. True beauty inspires love. False beauty inspires lust. Truth attracts, lies seduce. One is aligned to the truth and goodness of creation, and the other reduces all things to a matter of personal preference or subjective taste. We must train our children to sense the difference between these, the carnal and sensual, or that which is eternally true and good. Think of music and arts as a bridge between the human soul and the truth and goodness of the living God and his universe. People usually think of developing this virtue through listening to good music or looking at lovely art. But another way we can do this is by first studying science through God's creation. In studying nature and doing things like nature journaling, gardening, keeping animals, this awakens a child's love for the beauty and harmony of the creation. Teach them about the constellations by studying the Greek myths, and then read the scriptures and discuss the way God ordered the heavens to show man the passing of time. When we teach our children to love God, to love what God loves, and desire what God desires, they will be drawn to what is truly lovely and able to recognize when worldly desires are trying to draw them into that which is not true or not good. By cultivating truth, beauty, and goodness in our homeschool, our children will have the tools they need to go out into a lost and dying world and be a light unto life as resilient, moral, and capable adults. Resilient, moral, and capable adults are will find their purpose. They will serve their faith, their family, and mankind. Every education is going to contain gaps, but if they know how to wrestle with ideas, how to think through difficult questions, and how to learn, they will be connected to a higher purpose, and they will pursue training and work that is meaningful when the time is right. Because the beginning of knowledge is wisdom, but the end is action. Great thinkers and innovators have been produced in every culture and in every era, but only free societies encourage free, innovative, and critical thinking. As home educators, we are in a perfect position to do just this. Thus, creating a classical paideia in your home is not just possible, it's essential. It begins with knowing what you're leaving and then never looking back. I want to leave you with this encouragement from John 16. These things I have spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. As parents and educators, we do not have to embark upon this journey alone. God is with us every step of the way. Before I go, I want to take a moment to tell you about the courses I'm teaching for True North Homeschool Academy. This summer, I'm teaching career exploration. And yes, we are talking about exploring jobs and careers. And although I don't believe that is the be all end all of education, it is part of life. And hopefully, we're going to pursue these ideas within a framework of understanding that greater purpose and value that we have in this life. In fall, I'm teaching American history, and you can tell that I'm a great history buff. And we're going to be teaching it through film. So I kind of consider that sort of like my living books. We're going to approach American history from a concept of storytelling. Then I'm teaching psychology. And since my background is in social sciences, I think this will be an excellent course. And of course, I'll be teaching it from a Christian worldview. And I feel that the social sciences and Christianity really are sciences that marry well together and should be taught together within that framework. I'm also teaching a writing course in the fall, and this is a course for students who want to take their writing to a little bit higher level. We're going to be doing some basic introductory writing, but also we're going to culminate the course with a research paper, and I'll be teaching children how to do appropriate research and learn how to look at articles for bias and that sort of thing as well. And then we're going to do introduction to literature, lit and comp. So it's both obviously a literature and a writing course. And it's an introductory course. So it's for like ninth graders. And I'm really excited about this because I love great books and I love writing and I love teaching kids, proper writing, how to persevere in their writing. And then I'm going to be teaching a world literature and composition class. So again, more great books, but just at a higher level of literature and writing. I just want to thank you for spending this time with me, and I appreciate your attentiveness to this presentation, and I trust that it's been beneficial to you. And I want to thank all of these wonderful resources on education and Western civilization. And I pray that you have a blessed and wonderful school year.